A reminder of this week's big idea as we go through tonight's lesson is what is signification and what is cultural diffusion and why does it happen? So we're going to look at signification and cultural diffusion in Korea and Vietnam. The objective is identify major developments, political developments in Korea and Vietnam. So to begin with Korea, if you take a look at the current map, you can see almost all the way to the right, just west of Japan, is a peninsula sticking down that is Korea. Today is divided into North and South Korea, but that was not always the case. So let's take a look at the history. Here is a map of Korea in the 5th century. You'll notice there's 4 kingdoms. There's really 3 major ones. Goguryeo, the Silla, and the Pashke are the 3 major kingdoms that you'll read about. And Korea was majorly influenced by China, again, because of China's efforts to spread and signify its surrounding regions. However, Korea still maintains its own separate identity, still today. By 109 BC, the earliest Korean kingdom, the Chosun, is conquered by Han Emperor Wu Di. So way back into Unit 1, we have the Han expanding and conquering the Chosun kingdom. And it's during the Han Empire that Korea experiences its first wave of signification, which is, again, adopting Chinese culture. They adopt Buddhism, Chinese characters and Mandarin for their language, and they attempt a bureaucracy, but again, not a merit-based one, similar to Japan. It's a birthright-based. So the 3 major kingdoms in the 5th century during this era are Goguryeo, again, Silla, and Pashke. And these kingdoms are constantly fighting each other to maintain and earn control of Korea. Goguryeo, which you can see on the map at the right, is not touching land, or it is touching land, but it's the only one touching China directly. And it was really up to Goguryeo to fight against Chinese conquest, and they resisted Chinese conquest for a great deal of time. Pardon me. It was under the Tang dynasty in China that they came up with the idea to form an alliance with the Silla rulers in the south, the southeast of Korea. And it was with the help of an alliance with the Silla kingdom that the Chinese Tang dynasty was able to take control of all of Korea. And so by ship they went and worked with the Silla to conquer the Pashke, and then conquered Goguryeo to gain complete control of Korea. So again, Korea continued. When the Silla and Tang double team and worked together, they conquered the whole peninsula and then had to decide what to do as a result, how to divide what they had won in the war. And the Tang dynasty and the Silla did not agree. And seeing the weakness of the ruling order in the Goguryeo and Pashke regions, revolts broke out, and as a result, Korea became a tribute state, meaning it was not directly controlled and conquered by China, but instead, similar to the Aztecs, they had to pay tribute, and if they didn't, then China would come back and attack them. So essentially, Korea exists on its own as a tribute state, closely connected with China, but independent from China until the 20th century, which we will discuss in Unit 5, the change. Again, you do not need to write word for word. Gather the main idea of this information. You may want to pause if you're not done. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So think again, what is signification? It's the process of adoption of Chinese culture. And remember that culture can be religion, arts, language, social customs and norms, beliefs about the government, crafts, architecture, agricultural techniques, routines in daily life, gender roles, etc. So culture spans a wide range. So Korea did become, under its control of China and as a tribute state of China, Sinified. For example, the Korean capital was built to look like the Tang capital, with architecture, pagoda styles, etc. Especially the upper class aristocratic families adopted Chinese cultural elements. We're going to see this often as a trend, and it's because the upper class can afford to do this. They can afford to buy the new clothes, they can afford to get the education, they can afford to buy the pottery as seen at your right. Some upper class went and studied in Chinese school, and the majority of them practiced Buddhism. Many of the temples, like you saw in your book, were modeled after Chinese temples, so that pagoda architecture that you saw over and over again. And similar places, usually near water, very serene and beautiful settings in nature, etc. And Korean artwork also followed Chinese themes. You saw this in your textbook as well. What looked to be Chinese art was really Korean or Japanese art. So occasionally Korean art actually exceeded and was better than the Chinese examples. An example being ceramics. So the pottery you see at your right is a Korean style urn or water carrier, and it's more ornate. Okay, switching over to Vietnam. So you can see here that Vietnam, the Guangxi region is where Vietnam originally was. And you can see the label that says Vietnam is where the Vietnamese had to flee and move south to. So it's in Southeast Asia, south of China. And since in China they actually pronounce the last name first and the first name last, it's called Nam Viet in China. So before Chinese influence, the non-Viet people have well-established local customs and identity. They are not barbarians or savage, as the Chinese believed. Non-Viet means people of the South. So imagine who you think gave them this name. Did the Vietnamese name themselves, or from what point of view might the history be written? The Chinese thought these people of the South were barbarians, they spoke a different language, the Chinese didn't understand their customs, etc. And the Vietnamese spoken language was not at all related to Chinese. So like John Green talks about with barbarians, it sounded like bar, 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 bar. And that's where the term barbarian came from. And unlike China, Vietnamese favored small nuclear family. This means father, wife, and then just the children, not aunts and uncles and extended family with grandparents, etc. You may want to pause. I'm going to switch slides. So the Vietnamese relationship with the Han. Initially, China is okay with the Vietnam acting simply as a tribute state and paying tribute. But eventually the Han dynasty says, no, we're going to go in and govern directly. And looking at this map, you'll notice again that Vietnam used to be more north than it is today. They were forced south. And also that this is the same time as the Mauryan dynasty is ruling, as well as Rome. So a lot of different things going on throughout the world. When the Chinese came and directly ruled, the Vietnamese decided they had a lot to learn from the Chinese and could actually adopt a fair amount of Chinese culture. And so Chinese culture was introduced, and this was called, of course, Sinification. So Sinification did happen in Vietnam. Again, similar to Korea, it was especially prevalent among the elite, again, because they could afford it. Some, similar again to Korea, attended Chinese-style schools. They would read the works of Confucius, the works of Mencius, who was Confucius's partner. They adopted Chinese agricultural techniques and the rice that the Chinese used. They also adopted Chinese irrigation systems to water their crops. And they shifted away in Vietnam from their close-knit family and to embrace the extended family model, where they had bigger units with the grandparents, the aunts, and the uncles, and they would all live. The Chinese also began practicing ancestor worship, the Vietnamese, similar to China, to worship their ancestors. And so this respect for your elders and filial piety became paramount as well. You may want to pause if you're not done writing. I'm going to go on to the next slide. So although the Vietnamese did undergo Sinification, they were not always pleased with Chinese rule. They did adopt a fair amount of Chinese culture, such as the bureaucracy, although it was birthright-based, and Mandarin language. However, the Vietnamese are also resentful of Chinese rule. So around 39 CE, there's a revolt, and it's led by the Trung sisters. And the Trung sisters are born into a military family in rural Vietnam. And they are educated by their father and family in martial arts and art of warfare and fighting skills. The Trung sisters grow up, they marry husbands, and one of the Trung sisters marries a military general who begins speaking out against the Chinese and is consequently killed. It is a reaction to their anger for the death of her husband. The Trung sisters get all the women in their village together and teach them military skills, and the women form a rebellion. The trend catches on in nearby surrounding villages. The women also begin rebelling, and it's actually led by the Trung sisters that the Chinese are successfully pushed out of Vietnam. As you can probably imagine, the Chinese were not thrilled with this development. It was rather embarrassing, and so the Han army returned with a very large army. And really, their battle tactics were quite interesting because when they knew they were fighting a horde of women, the Chinese males showed up entirely naked. And so faced with an entirely naked male army, the women began retreating because they didn't feel it was morally correct to fight a bunch of naked men. And then the myth goes that on the retreat, one woman on the battlefield gave birth to a son, and one of his arms was a sword, and that was a symbol that the women should fight, and they turned around and fought back against the Chinese. Unfortunately, the rebellion was unsuccessful. They were only able to hold off the Chinese for a year, but it's pretty impressive, and think about what that tells you about women in Vietnam compared to women in China, where we have foot binding, etc. So by 1939, the Vietnamese had won independence, or 939, pardon me. So from around 40 CE to 939, Vietnam is conquered by China. It wins independence, which it maintains until much later in Unit 5, when we'll talk about the colonization of Vietnam. So after Chinese rule, Vietnam fights from time to time with neighbors in the area, the Khmers in Cambodia, the Chams, so that they're in Laos. And slowly the people moved south as they faced pressures, and that's where Vietnam got its location today. Divisions crop up between southern and northern Vietnam, which takes a lot of Vietnam's energy and focus, and actually is one of the causes of the Vietnam War. And as a result, since they were so focused internally, Vietnam allowed France to involve themselves more easily, and they were more easily colonized than they might otherwise have been. And that is all for tonight. I'll see you.